Okay, in this video, what I'm going to cover is we're looking more at the data mart and continuing on with the ETL process beyond the getting the data loaded into staging. So where we're at this point, if you were to look at our ETL package here, we're going to go over all of these different steps with loading the data into the various dimensions and then finally into the fact table. So I've pre-made the ETL package, but I am going to go over each step in detail. But just as a review from previous recordings, what we've done so far is we've gotten data from a CSV file and we've loaded it into a staging table. So if we look here, this is what our data mart looks like. So we just look at the diagram. We have a fact table here with a year dimension. We have a city dimension. There's a hierarchy to a state. So there's a foreign key relationship between the state ID to the city. And so the city ID and the year ID exist in the fact table that have foreign key relationships with those two dimensions. And then everything else in the fact table is a measurable piece of data with an exception of the row ID from the source table. This is just for data validation purposes. Every single table has its own primary key, so the fact table has its own primary key called crime ID, and that's an auto-generated identity column. Same thing with the two dimensions, the city ID and the state ID. Those are auto-generated primary key columns, and the year dimension. So right now, if we just look at staging, what we've done so far is we've just loaded all of the data in the CSV file, from the CSV file, into this staging table. Now notice that after importing it, we've got the state ID is null, city ID is null, and year ID is null. This is because these identity columns did not exist in the source CSV. These are surrogate identities that we're going to create inside of our data mart. So our staging table in this case is used to basically, we're going to generate the IDs and the dimensions and then match those identities up here in our staging table next to the appropriate descriptive column. You'll see that more come alive as we go through these different steps. The reason why we do that is because the very last step we're going to do in our ETL package is load the data into the fact table. And the fact table, as we said, is going to include all the measurable columns along with two identity columns that are foreign keyed to two different dimensions. So let's look at this strategy that we can use to populate these different tables. So everything anchors off of our staging table, which is why it's important to get that loaded first. So let's go back to our ETL package. Now the very first task, so on the control flow tab of your SQL Server Integration Services project, the very first stage was, and we have another video on this, was just getting the data into staging, is a data flow task. Now sometimes we'll use execute SQL tasks, so I'll be able to demonstrate both of those. Now the very next step that we have is a data flow task, so I just dragged and dropped that over here to the screen and I renamed it load state dimension. So let's double click on that and see what that looks like. Now on this data flow task, I've just dragged two objects onto the design palette. I dragged the OLEDB data source right here. I dragged one of these. Oh, that's the destination, sorry. I dragged the source first. So the OLEDB source. And then I dragged the OLEDB destination right below it, and then I just connected this to that. So all I did here on the staging table We know that in our first step, the objective is to populate the state dimension. Now, when we populate dimensions, if there are hierarchies, so if we look here at our database diagram, we want to populate the most peripheral tables only. In other words, those that are furthest away from the fact table. So we see here that the fact table gets to the city dimension gets to the state dimension. So we want to populate the state dimension first. We're going to auto-generate these IDs, and then we're going to take those identities and we're going to put them right here in the staging table. So everywhere it says Alaska, it'll have an ID associated with that ID generated inside the dimension. So in our staging table, we've got 25,683 rows. The objective is to get a distinct list of states that reside in our staging table. So to do that, we would go into Management Studio right here and develop a query. So my query I developed here just says select distinct state from the staging, and so it gives me a distinct list of states, and I ordered it by state in ascending order. So this shows that there's 51 states inside of our staging table. Now the idea is to get these 51 states to insert inside of our state dimension. So right now, if we look in our state dimension, right here, you'll see that there's nothing in there. We have two columns, state ID and state. So I want those 51 rows to insert in here, and that because the identity column is set to auto identity, it will just auto populate as 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth. So right here, you can, by default, you can, in these OLE DB data sources, you will see in the drop down you can choose a table, but you can also choose a SQL command in the drop down. There's really only two things to configure here. You select your connection manager. So in this case, our connection manager goes to the crime database. And all we're going to do is execute this SQL command that gives me a distinct list of states, and it's just going to give us a state. And we're going to take that data set and we're going to move it to our destination table, our OLE DB destination, and I just chose our specific database, and we're going to put it inside of the state dimension. And then you click on this mappings, and the only field that it's going to do, so from our source, we're grabbing a distinct list of states, and it's going to match to the set of states in our dimension. The ID is left alone. We don't map to that because that's auto-generated. So really that's all we've done. OLE DB source right here, and OLE DB destination. That's it, nothing fancy. Once we do that, we right click and we just click execute task. It's then going to run that query that gets a distinct list of states. And we see that it grabbed 51 rows. So I'm going to click stop. And if I go back to Management Studio and we click execute, we now see that we have 51 rows of 51 states. You see that the ID auto-generated 1 through 51. Okay, so our state dimension has been populated. Now remember, the goal here is once we create the dimensions one at a time, we go back to our staging table here, and we want for Alaska, so we would want, if we look at the crime.dim state, so right here for Alaska is the number 2 in our dimension. So everywhere here it says Alaska in the state ID, we want it to be the number 2. So it matches that up. Okay. So let's look at how we do that. We're going to have to write a query for that. So let's go back over here to our control flow tab. And this time, instead of doing a data flow task, I drag and drop an execute SQL task, and I put that right here. And then each time I do a step, I just connect it through these arrows. Okay. And so let's take a look at, I drag and dropped an execute SQL task, and I renamed it update the state ID into the staging table. So an execute SQL task, you really just need to set a couple of fields here. You need to know what you need to connect to the connection manager. Remember, every time we talk about the connection manager, my project has 2 connections. I have one that I had predefined up here that connects to my local database. And then this one connects to my local CSV file. Well, we only use that in the very beginning when we get data into our staging. The rest of the time we're connecting to a database. So this connection manager handles that. So anyway, let's go back to this. So you would choose your local connection right here in the connection manager, and then you have a SQL statement. So in my case, I wrote an update statement, and let's look at this code. Let's see what it looks like. So I'm just going to open this up here. Actually, we might as well just use this one here. And let's look at this code. So what I'm doing is I'm writing an update statement. And I'm saying here, I want you to update the staging table. And here's what I want you to update. I want you to set the state ID in the staging table to equal the state ID in the state dimension. From the staging table, I want you to inner join the state dimension on where the state equals the state. So where it says Alaska in staging, I want you to join on where it says Alaska in the state dimension. Now where those 2 match on both sides, I want you to also make the state ID equal the state ID on both sides. So that's where the update happens in the set command. So I wrote this query, and all I did was I just put it here. Let me close that. Sorry about that. So all I did was I just pasted that query right here in this SQL query window. So I just changed the connection and I changed the SQL statement. Okay. And then all I need to do is just right click on that step. And again, I recommend you execute these tasks one at a time while you're developing these. So we're just going to execute that SQL task, and it's going to run only that task. And as long as you've done everything correctly, you get a green check. I'll click stop on the package. Let's go back to SQL. I'm going to just leave that alone. I'm going to go back to here, and I'm going to re-execute this select star from my staging table. And when I click execute this time, you can see that the state ID is now populated with all the identities that were in the state dimension. So everywhere I see Alaska now, I see the number 2. So now that we've done that, we can go on to the next step. Let's load the state dimension. Now remember, we said that the state dimension comes from a hierarchy, right? So we're going to load the city dimension next. So since we've loaded this, we have all these state IDs, right? We now can use that identity inside the city dimension. Okay, so let's see how we do that. Let's come back to our package. Okay, so to load the city dimension, I did the same exact thing. All I did was I grabbed an OLE DB data source, right here, and then an OLE DB destination right here. So this is my source here, and this is my destination here. Okay, and I renamed it. So this one I said get all the city and the state ID from the staging table. Now remember, since we know that it is possible to have the same city name in multiple states, if we want to get a unique list of states, excuse me, a unique list of cities, we must get a unique list of the city along with its associated state ID. So let's look at this query. Here's a query that I've developed, and I usually would do this in Management Studio. So let's go back at our query palette here, and let's put this in here, this query. There we go. And let's just execute that and take a look at what we have. So from our staging table, I'm saying get a distinct list of cities along with its associated state ID. So we have Abbeville with the state ID number 1. And so like if we come down here and we see all of these different cities associated. So for instance, here is Cordova. So Cordova with state ID 2, I know that that's in Alaska because we know from the state dimension that number 2 was Alaska. So that's what we're getting. So what we do is that becomes our source here. That becomes our source. And then we're going to insert that into the destination, which would be our city dimension. And what we're going to map here is we're going to map the city and the state ID from the staging into the city dimension, 1 for 1. So let's go ahead and let's execute this task. So we could just right click out here in this space, click execute task, wait for that task to execute, and let's look at the results. Okay. There we go. We inserted 9,615 rows in our city dimension. So if we come over here and we say select star from crime.dim city, now we should see right here all of the state IDs associated with the city. And you can see that we have 9,615 rows. Okay. Now that we've done that, can you imagine we're going to come back, right, and we want to update in our staging table the city ID with the appropriate city. So Anchorage should have the appropriate city ID that is based upon the appropriate, right here, city ID that's generated in the city dimension. So how do we do that? So we come back here to the control flow, and we have another step, and this step we created a script task. So remember the 2 tasks up top we use in this example are the data flow task and the execute SQL task. So I just dragged and dropped an execute SQL task as the next step after loading the city dimension. And remember, like I said before, really 2 fields you need to change, the connection and then the SQL statement. So let's look at the SQL statement that I developed inside of Management Studio. So let's take a look. So here, what are we doing? We're updating the staging table, and we're going to set the city ID in the staging table to equal the city ID in the city dimension. Now, from the staging table, what we want to do is join the name of the city in the staging table to the name of the city in the city dimension. We also want to join the state ID in the staging table with the state ID in the city dimension. This way we get the appropriate city ID that is associated with the appropriate state. We get that ID and we update the staging table. So again, here's what that query looks like. Okay. We could even bring it down here so it's easier to look at. Okay, we have this and right there in between these 2 joints. Okay, so let's go back to that step And let's right click on that step and click execute task. Wait for it to complete. It's done. Hit stop. Let's go back to Management Studio. Just going to get rid of that query. And we're going to go back over here. And now let's re-execute the select star, and notice now the city ID is now populated. For every city we have an appropriate city ID. The final thing we need to populate in the staging table and the dimension is the year ID. So let's go back to our package. We have another data flow task we dragged and dropped right here on the screen. We renamed it load year dimension. So if we come over here right now and we ran this dim year, we have nothing in the table. And then in our staging we have no ID. Okay, so let's look at what we did here. Notice that I have an execute SQL task for this. The reason why I have that is because if you look at my dimension year, I have 3 columns. I have the year, which is inside of my source CSV, but I've also included a new column called the Chinese New Year. Now the Chinese New Year is not inside my source data. It's not even in my staging. It's a derived field. So what I did was I wrote some code to get the derived Chinese New Year for the appropriate year. So let's look at that code. So again, I have an execute SQL task right here. If we open this, all we did was set the connection. Let's take a look at the code that I developed for this. Let's take a look. So here's what we've got. In this case, instead of using one of those data flow tasks, I actually create the SQL statement that takes data from staging and inserts it into a dimension. Sort of manual way of doing it in code. That's done using an insert into select statement. So if you could think of this insert into as your typical select or typical insert statement. So we're saying insert into the year of the year dimension. I want you to grab this data that says select distinct year. So if I just select this right here, I have 3 distinct years in my staging table. So if you were to look at all of those thousands of rows, you would only find 2006, 07, and 08 as the distinct years. So I want to take these 3 years and insert them into the year column of the year dimension first. After I do that, I'm going to run 3 update statements. And all I'm saying here is set the Chinese New Year in the year dimension to equal the string dog, where the year would be equal to 2006. Update the Chinese year to pig, where the year is equal to 2007. And then finally, update the Chinese New Year equal rat, where the year is equal to 08. So this just shows you how you can manually derive data and insert it into a dimension. So we're going to take that code and we're going to execute this step right here. And I'm going to say execute task for loading our year dimension. It will run that SQL code. Once that's complete, I go over here and I'm going to get rid of all this code, and I'm going to say select all fields from crime.dimYear. And now you can see that we got our auto-generated identity 06, 07, 08, the dog, the pig, and the rat. So the next thing to do, since we have this dimension built, is to get that data and populate it everywhere we see 2007. We should see the number 2 right there. So how do we do that? Well, we created another script task here, execute SQL task right here. We just renamed it update year ID in the staging. So let's look at that code. All right. So let's see what this is doing. We're going to update the staging table, and we're going to set the year ID in the staging table to equal the year ID in the year dimension. And from the staging table, we're going to join on the year dimension where the year, the name of the year in the staging table is equal to the name of the year. So in the year dimension. So this would say 2006 is equal to 2006. Grab that year ID and put it into the staging table. So we're not going to worry about the Chinese New Year because that's additional intelligence that's added to our dimension. Descriptive information. So let's execute that. We're going to right click here and say execute task. Let that complete. Green check. Stop. Let's go back here. We're going to get rid of this query just in case I don't want to read. So let's re-execute our staging table. And now you can see that our year ID has been populated. So now we've gotten all of our data populated inside of our staging table. So what's left? The only thing left to do then is to populate the fact table. So once all dimensions have been appropriately populated and your staging table has all of the data needed to move to the fact table, that's the final step. And really it's the easiest step. So we've got the data flow task here, and I dragged and dropped that right here and named it load fact crime table. And all I basically did was grab an OLE DB source, so right here, and I grabbed an OLE DB destination, connected the two. I get the data from the staging table, and I grabbed the columns from the staging table. No big deal there. And then over here on our destination, we're going to the fact table, the fact crime table, but the mappings is what's important. So what I want to bring over to my fact table is only what I'm supposed to. So I've got my row ID. I'm going to bring that into my fact table from staging because that's going to help me with my data validation. I need the city ID. I need the year ID. I don't bring any other ID to the crime ID in the fact table because crime ID is the primary key column and it is auto-generated in the fact table. All of my measurable data, population, violent crime, and so forth, and all the way down. Notice we only bring over the fields that we need to match to our fact table. We didn't bring state ID. We didn't need that because state ID is a hierarchy from city and it doesn't sit close to the fact table. So these are only the fields that we need to populate. So once we do that, before we do that, let's just make sure we got no data right now. So if I say select star from crime dot, and this is our fact crime table. So right now we have no data in our fact table, okay? So if I come over here to this step, I right click and I execute the task. Let the data goes from staging, 25,683 rows, into the fact table. Click stop, come back here and click execute. Now all of our data is appropriately populated inside of our fact table. Now we're capable of writing a query that has multiple joins inside of our crime data mart.